You've seen the photographs 1,000 times. Golden limestone rising against an impossibly blue sky, tourists posing with camels, the Sphinx gazing eternally toward the horizon. The Giza Plateau has become so iconic, so embedded in our collective imagination, that it's easy to assume we understand it. We think we know the story. Pharaohs built tombs, workers hauled blocks, and ancient Egypt left behind monuments to impress the gods and the ages. But here's what most visitors never hear as they snap their selfies and climb back onto air-conditioned buses. The local stone masons who work in the shadow of these colossi will tell you something different. They'll tell you that the precision they see in the Great Pyramid's core blocks, the perfectly flush joints, the laser-straight internal passages, the sheer scale of the foundation work, represents a level of skill that even modern contractors struggle to replicate. They'll point to where patterns on the Sphinx that don't match the accepted timeline, to alignments that seem to encode astronomical knowledge we didn't think existed in the 3rd millennium BC, and to construction techniques that appear, vanish, and never reappear in the archaeological record. These aren't fringe conspiracies whispered in the dark corners of the internet. These are observations that Egyptologists themselves debate in academic journals, that engineers puzzle over at conferences, and that geologists have risked their reputations to investigate. So what if everything you thought you knew about Giza is just the surface story? What if the monuments on this desert plateau encode secrets we're only beginning to glimpse? Secrets about lost technologies, forgotten timelines, and a level of sophistication that challenges our entire narrative of human civilization's development. Today, we're going deep. We're going to walk you through the evidence that doesn't make it into the glossy coffee table books. We'll examine the construction anomalies that have no satisfactory explanation, the mathematical relationships that seem too precise to be coincidental, the geological mysteries that suggest these structures might be far older than official chronologies allow, and the sheer logistical impossibilities that make even sympathetic scholars shake their heads in wonder. We'll look at what the ancient texts actually say versus what we've assumed they meant, at the physical evidence that contradicts comfortable narratives, and at the questions that remain stubbornly unanswered despite decades of research and millions of dollars in scientific investigation. This isn't about rejecting scholarship or embracing fantasy. This is about facing the gaps in our knowledge with intellectual honesty and recognizing that the Giza Plateau, despite being one of the most studied archaeological sites on Earth, still holds mysteries that nobody can fully explain. So settle in, because for the next hour, we're going to explore the evidence that suggests these monuments are far stranger, far older, and far more sophisticated than almost anyone is willing to admit. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, known to the ancient Egyptians as Ake Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, stands as the oldest and largest of the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau, and yet it represents a level of precision that wasn't matched by any subsequent pyramid in Egypt. Think about that for a moment. The first attempt is the best attempt. The prototype exceeds all the copies. That's not how technology normally works. When Khufu's architects and masons completed this monument around 2560 BC, they created a structure whose base covers 13 acres, whose 4 sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an average error of just 3 arc minutes. That's 1/20th of a single degree. And whose original height of 481 feet made it the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. But here's where the numbers start to feel uncanny. The base is leveled to within less than an inch across its entire 756-foot length, a tolerance that would challenge modern surveyors working with laser equipment. The corners are almost perfect right angles, deviating by only a few arc seconds. And the whole massive structure, originally composed of approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, sits on a foundation that had to be carved out of the living bedrock with absolute precision, because if the base isn't level, if the corners aren't square, the entire pyramid collapses into geometric chaos as you build upward. Picture yourself as one of the engineers tasked with this project. You're working in the early Bronze Age with copper tools, rope, and wooden sledges. You need to survey a 13-acre site on uneven bedrock, establish a perfectly level foundation, orient your structure to true north with extraordinary accuracy, and then maintain that precision through more than 2 million blocks stacked over 200 courses to a height of 40 stories. The mathematics alone would be daunting. The Egyptians used a base 10 counting system and had sophisticated geometry, but they didn't have decimal notation, didn't have the concept of zero in their mathematical notation, and certainly didn't have calculators or computer-aided design. Yet somehow, they achieved tolerances that modern construction firms would be proud to match. When British engineer William Flinders Petrie conducted the first truly scientific survey of the pyramid in the 1880s, he was astonished by what he found. His measurements revealed that the base of the pyramid was leveled to within 0.7 inches over its entire 756-foot length, that the sides were straight to within fractions of an inch, and that internal passages were carved through solid bedrock with such precision that you couldn't slip a piece of paper between the stones and the passage walls in many places. Petrie, who went to Egypt expecting to debunk the more sensational claims about the pyramid, instead became one of its most eloquent witnesses to its inexplicable precision. But the mystery deepens when you examine how the blocks themselves were fitted together. In the core of the pyramid, especially in the lower courses, you find blocks that weigh not 2.5 tons but 50, 60, even 70 tons each. These massive stones are fitted together with joints so tight that you can't slide a razor blade between them, despite the fact that their mating surfaces are not flat but slightly curved, a technique called concave jointing, that creates a form-fitting connection stronger than any mortar could achieve. Think about the logistics of that for a moment. You've quarried a 70-ton block of limestone from the Mokattam Formation on the eastern side of the Nile. You've somehow transported it across the river, presumably on barges during the annual flood when the Nile rises close to the level of the plateau. You've dragged it up ramps or rolled it on logs to its position in the pyramid. And now you need to position it so precisely against its neighbors that the joint gap is effectively zero along a contact surface that might be 8 feet long and 4 feet high. How? With what tools? Using what technique? The standard explanation is that workers used pounding stones to dress the surfaces, checking fit by trial and error, rubbing the blocks together and looking for high spots marked by friction, then pounding down those high spots until a perfect fit was achieved. But this explanation requires extraordinary patience and time. You need to lift and reposition these multi-ton blocks repeatedly, making tiny adjustments each time. The labor and time investment would be staggering, and yet this level of precision appears throughout the structure, not just in a few showcase areas. Now let's talk about the internal passages, because this is where the precision becomes almost eerie. The descending passage, which slopes down from the original entrance on the north face into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, is a tunnel about 3.5 feet wide and 3.5 feet high that descends at an angle of 26 degrees, 31 minutes, and 23 seconds for a distance of over 345 feet. That angle doesn't vary by more than 1/4 of a degree over the entire length. The walls are dressed limestone, the floor is smooth, and the ceiling is flat, and all 4 surfaces run parallel to each other, maintaining the rectangular cross-section with remarkable consistency. Cutting a straight tunnel through solid limestone with copper chisels should result in wandering, in deviations, in changes of direction as you encounter harder and softer layers in the stone. But the descending passage is almost geometrically perfect. The same is true of the ascending passage, which branches off from the descending passage and rises at a steep angle of 26.5 degrees toward the interior chambers. These passages were cut through solid limestone, some of it core blocks, some of it bedrock, and yet they maintain their dimensions and angles with a precision that seems almost impossible given the tools available. Here's where it gets tricky. In the king's chamber, located near the center of the pyramid about 1/3 of the way up from the base, you find granite blocks weighing between 50 and 80 tons each forming the walls and ceiling. These aren't local limestone. This is red Aswan granite, a hard igneous rock that had to be transported over 500 miles from quarries near Aswan in the far south of Egypt. Granite is tough stuff. It contains quartz crystals that are nearly as hard as diamond, and it would have been almost impossible to cut and shape with the copper tools that represent the hardest metal available to the Egyptians at that time. Bronze, which is harder than copper, didn't become common in Egypt until later dynasties. And yet the granite blocks in the king's chamber are cut and fitted with the same precision as the limestone blocks elsewhere in the pyramid. The ceiling is composed of 9 massive granite beams, each weighing approximately 50 tons, spanning the 20-foot width of the chamber. Above those 9 beams are 5 so-called relieving chambers, spaces filled with more massive granite blocks arranged horizontally to distribute the weight of the millions of tons of masonry above. The engineering principle is sound. You're creating a series of air gaps so that the crushing weight of the pyramid doesn't collapse the king's chamber ceiling. But the execution requires cutting, transporting, and positioning dozens of 50-ton granite blocks with millimeter precision at a height of about 140 feet above ground level. How do you even lift a 50-ton block that high, let alone set it gently into position? Engineers and researchers have proposed dozens of theories: straight ramps that would have required more material than the pyramid itself, spiral ramps that wrap around the structure, internal ramps built within the pyramid's core, counterweight systems, water-powered lifts, and more. Each has strengths and weaknesses, and each requires technologies or organizational capacities that strain the evidence we have about early Bronze Age Egypt. Some researchers, looking at the sheer improbability of the achievement, have suggested that the precision we see in the Great Pyramid represents knowledge inherited from an earlier, more technologically advanced culture, a civilization lost to history whose techniques were imperfectly preserved and never fully recovered by subsequent dynasties. This would explain why Khufu's pyramid is the best and why later pharaohs, despite having all the resources of the Egyptian state at their disposal, never matched it. It would explain why certain construction techniques, like the massive granite beams and the precision core work, appear at Giza and then largely vanish from the architectural record. But it raises a host of new questions. Who are these earlier builders? When did they exist? Why is there no other clear evidence of their presence? The mainstream answer is that we're overthinking it, that skilled craftsmen with ample time and manpower could have achieved these results using the tools we know they had. But spend an hour examining the joints between the blocks, measuring the passages with modern instruments, calculating the logistics of quarrying and transporting 2.3 million stones, and you'll begin to feel the nagging sense that something doesn't quite add up. We have a monument of extraordinary precision built at the dawn of monumental architecture, using techniques that seem to exceed the capabilities of the available technology, and we're expected to believe it was the first try. Maybe it was. Maybe the ancient Egyptians were simply better engineers than we give them credit for. Or maybe the Great Pyramid is whispering to us about a chapter of human history we haven't yet learned to read. If the precision of the Great Pyramid's construction is the first layer of mystery, the mathematical relationships embedded in its dimensions form a second, deeper puzzle that has occupied researchers for more than a century. And I'm not talking about numerology or mystical number games. I'm talking about verifiable geometric and mathematical relationships that appear to encode sophisticated knowledge of the Earth, the solar system, and fundamental mathematical constants. Let's start with the most famous: the relationship between the pyramid's height and its base perimeter. If you take the original height of the pyramid, 481 feet, or about 280 Egyptian royal cubits, and double it, then divide the base perimeter by that doubled height, you get a number very close to pi, approximately 3.14159. Now, you might think that's just a coincidence, a happy accident of the proportions the builders chose. Except that pi is an irrational number, meaning it can't be expressed as a simple fraction, and it doesn't occur naturally in the geometry of rectangles or squares. It's a property of circles and spheres. The ancient Egyptians didn't have a written symbol for pi, and the earliest known approximation of pi in Egyptian mathematics comes from the Rhind papyrus, dated to around 1650 BC, nearly 1,000 years after the pyramid was built. That papyrus gives a value of approximately 3.16, which is close but not as accurate as the ratio encoded in the Great Pyramid's proportions. So how did the pyramid's architects encode a more accurate value of pi into their structure? Apparently without having a formal mathematical definition of the constant. One possibility is that they were using measuring techniques based on rolling. If you roll a wheel or cylinder, The distance it travels in one complete revolution equals the circumference, which is related to pi. It's conceivable that Egyptian surveyors used rolling measurement devices and empirically discovered the relationship without formalizing it mathematically. But here's the part that starts to feel less like coincidence and more like intentional design. The Great Pyramid's dimensions also encode the mathematical constant phi, the golden ratio, approximately 1.618. If you take the slant height of the pyramid, the distance from the apex to the midpoint of one of the base edges, and divide it by half the base length, you get a number very close to phi. The golden ratio is another irrational number, one that appears frequently in nature, in the spiral of seashells, the branching of trees, the proportions of the human body, and it has unique mathematical properties that fascinated Greek mathematicians centuries after the pyramid was built. The fact that both pi and phi appear to be encoded in the pyramid's proportions suggests either an extraordinary coincidence, or a level of mathematical knowledge that conventional chronologies don't account for. But the mathematical mysteries don't stop there. Researchers have pointed out that the Great Pyramid's base perimeter, when measured in Egyptian royal cubits, approximately 20.62 inches per cubit, is about 1,760 cubits, and that number, when divided by 2 and multiplied by certain scaling factors, approximates the polar radius of the Earth. In fact, if you consider the pyramid as a scale model of the northern hemisphere, with the apex representing the North Pole and the base representing the equator, the ratio between the pyramid's height and its base perimeter matches the ratio between the Earth's polar radius and the Earth's circumference at the equator, accounting for the slight flattening of the Earth due to its rotation. This implies that the pyramid's builders knew that the Earth was a sphere, not a flat disk, as many ancient cultures believed, knew the dimensions of that sphere, and chose to encode that knowledge in their monument. The mainstream objection is that this is cherry-picking, that you can find all sorts of numerical relationships in a structure with fixed dimensions, especially if you're willing to use different units of measurement, different scaling factors, and a bit of rounding. And that's a fair critique. But the counterargument is that the relationships keep showing up, consistently, across multiple measurements and multiple mathematical constants. At some point, coincidence starts to strain credibility. Then there's the astronomical alignment, which ties into mathematics through celestial mechanics. The Great Pyramid is aligned almost perfectly to true north, deviating by only about 3 arc minutes. True north is not the same as magnetic north. It's the direction to the north celestial pole, the point in the sky around which all stars appear to rotate due to Earth's rotation. Aligning a structure to true north requires astronomical observation. You need to track the movement of stars or the sun and use geometric principles to establish the north-south meridian. Several methods have been proposed for how the Egyptians might have done this: sighting on circumpolar stars, using shadow measurements at the equinoxes, or tracking the rising and setting points of stars on the eastern and western horizons. But all of these methods require precision instruments, careful record-keeping, and sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. And the fact that the pyramid is so precisely aligned suggests that this wasn't an approximate effort or a ritual gesture. It was a deliberate, engineered result that required significant astronomical knowledge. Some researchers have taken this further, noting that the 3 pyramids of Giza, Khufu's, Khafre's, and Menkaur's, have a spatial arrangement that roughly mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt, a constellation that was deeply significant in Egyptian mythology as the celestial home of Osiris. The correlation isn't perfect, and critics have pointed out that if you look at enough stars and enough monuments, you'll eventually find patterns. But the Orion Correlation Theory, popularized by researchers like Robert Schoch, raises interesting questions about whether the pyramid complex was designed as a kind of terrestrial map of the sky, a sacred landscape that mirrored the heavens. Now, let's be fair, not all Egyptologists accept these interpretations, and many are skeptical of the claims that the pyramids encode advanced mathematical or astronomical knowledge. The counterargument goes like this: the ancient Egyptians were brilliant empirical engineers who learned by doing, who used practical techniques to achieve practical results, and who didn't necessarily understand the theoretical mathematics underlying their constructions. They might have used ropes and measuring rods in ways that naturally produced ratios close to pi or phi without knowing those constants as abstract mathematical entities. They might have aligned their structures to the cardinal directions because those directions had religious significance, using straightforward observational techniques that resulted in high accuracy. And the Orion correlation might be a modern projection onto an ancient landscape, a case of seeing patterns where the builders saw only pragmatic placement of monuments. All of that is possible, likely even. But it doesn't fully dispel the sense of mystery. Because even if we grant that the Egyptians were empirical rather than theoretical mathematicians, we're still left with the question of how they achieved such precision and why the proportions of the Great Pyramid happened to encode these mathematically significant relationships. Was it intentional? Was it unconscious cultural knowledge passed down through generations of master builders? Or are we, as modern observers, imposing our own mathematical frameworks onto a structure whose meaning we don't fully grasp? The pyramid, silent and enigmatic, offers no answers, only the mute testimony of its stones and the endless invitation to measure, calculate, and wonder. If the Great Pyramid is a mystery wrapped in precision, the Great Sphinx is a riddle wrapped in weathered stone, and its mysteries cut even deeper into the question of Giza's true age. You've probably seen it in photographs, a colossal figure with a lion's body and a human head, carved from a single outcropping of limestone on the Giza Plateau, its paws stretched out before it, its gaze fixed on the eastern horizon where the sun rises each morning. The conventional dating places the Sphinx in the reign of Khafre, the pharaoh who built the second pyramid at Giza, around 2500 BC. This dating is based largely on stylistic analysis of the Sphinx's face, which some Egyptologists believe resembles Khafre, though the features are so eroded that this is debatable, and on its proximity to Khafre's causeway and valley temple. But here's the problem. Unlike the pyramids, which were built from transported blocks and whose construction techniques can be studied in detail, the Sphinx was carved directly from the bedrock. There are no datable artifacts sealed within its body, no inscriptions on the statue itself identifying its builder, and no contemporary texts that unambiguously describe its creation. What we have instead is a monument whose body shows signs of weathering that don't match the weathering patterns of other structures on the Giza Plateau. Weathering that some geologists argue could only have been caused by sustained rainfall, and lots of it. This is where things get contentious. Egypt today is a desert. The Giza Plateau receives only an inch or two of rain per year, and it's been a dry climate for thousands of years. But the body of the Sphinx, the part that was carved from the softer layers of limestone in the Sphinx enclosure, shows deep, vertical erosion channels and undulating profiles that look like the work of flowing water rather than wind and sand. In the early 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch from Boston University examined the Sphinx and the walls of the enclosure in which it sits, and concluded that the erosion patterns were consistent with prolonged rainfall, not with the kind of wind erosion that dominates in the desert. He argued that to produce the observed weathering, the Sphinx would need to have been exposed to a wetter climate, one that existed in Egypt not in 2500 BC but thousands of years earlier, during the African humid period when the Sahara was still green and rivers and lakes dotted the landscape. That period ended around 5000 to 4000 BC, which would make the Sphinx at least 7,000 years old, possibly older, and would push its origins back into the Neolithic, long before the rise of pharaonic civilization. Imagine standing in the Sphinx enclosure on a hot desert morning, the sun already hammering down, the wind kicking up dust. Run your hand along the limestone walls that rise around you. These are the same walls that were carved out when the Sphinx was created, the same rock that the Sphinx's body was fashioned from. You'll feel the rippled, furrowed surface, the scalloped depressions, the vertical channels that cut down from the top of the wall toward the floor. Now compare that to the weathering on the temples and pyramids nearby, structures that we know were built in the Old Kingdom and have been exposed to the same desert conditions for the same length of time. You'll see a different pattern, sharper edges, flaking and exfoliation where the stone has been attacked by windblown sand, but not the same deep, flowing erosion. Schoch's argument was that this discrepancy points to two different periods of construction. The Sphinx and its enclosure were carved in a much earlier era when rainfall was common, and the temples and pyramids were added later, during the dry period of the Old Kingdom. Mainstream Egyptologists pushed back hard against this interpretation, arguing that the erosion could be explained by a combination of factors: wind, sand, moisture wicking up from a higher ancient water table, chemical weathering from dew and occasional rain, and even subsurface weathering of the softer limestone layers before the Sphinx was carved. They also point out that accepting a pre-dynastic date for the Sphinx creates enormous problems for the archaeological record. It would mean a monument of incredible sophistication was created by a culture that, according to all other evidence, was still using stone tools and living in small villages, thousands of years before writing, before centralized states, before monumental architecture supposedly began in Egypt. But the water weathering hypothesis refuses to go away, and it's been bolstered by other lines of evidence. Some researchers have pointed to seismic surveys conducted in the early 1990s that detected anomalies beneath the Sphinx, suggesting the presence of chambers or voids under its paws and body. If such chambers exist, and they haven't been excavated, so we don't know for sure, they might contain artifacts or inscriptions that could resolve the dating question. There are also the so-called inventory stela, an ancient Egyptian inscription found at Giza that claims Khufu restored the Sphinx, not that he or his successors built it, implying the Sphinx was already ancient in Khufu's time. Most Egyptologists dismiss the inventory stela as a later, unreliable text, possibly written during the 26th dynasty, around 600 BC, as a piece of priestly propaganda. But for those inclined to question the orthodox timeline, it's a tantalizing hint that even the ancient Egyptians themselves believed the Sphinx predated the pyramids. Here's where the mystery takes on a mythic dimension. Local legends and Arab historical texts, written long after pharaonic Egypt fell, refer to the Sphinx as the father of terrors, and speak of hidden knowledge buried beneath it, of secret passages leading to underground halls where the wisdom of an earlier age was preserved. The 4th century Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that subterranean passages connected the Sphinx to the Great Pyramid, and that these passages contained inscriptions describing the accomplishments of a lost civilization. Modern ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys hint at voids and cavities beneath the plateau, but access to these areas is tightly controlled by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, and large-scale excavation has never been permitted. Why? The official reason is that excavation could damage the monuments, that looters and instability make it dangerous, and that resources are limited. The unofficial whisper, the one you'll hear from some researchers, is that discoveries beneath the Sphinx could upend the established narrative of Egyptian history, and that there's institutional resistance to findings that don't fit comfortably within accepted chronologies. Is that a conspiracy theory, or a rational concern about academic reputations and tourism narratives? Probably a bit of both. Still, for all the evidence and counter-evidence, we're left with a monument whose age is genuinely uncertain. We have geological arguments that suggest it's older than the orthodox dating allows. We have archaeological arguments that insist it must date to the Old Kingdom because there's no plausible earlier culture capable of creating it. We have ancient texts that are maddeningly ambiguous, and we have modern geophysical data that hint at hidden structures we're not allowed to excavate. The Sphinx sits in its sandy enclosure, slowly weathering away, its face worn almost smooth, its body crumbling in places, and it holds its secrets close. Was it carved by Khufu's artisans, a fitting monument to the pharaoh whose pyramid towers behind it? Or does it date back thousands of years earlier, to a time when the Sahara was green and unknown architects carved a colossal guardian to watch over mysteries we've forgotten? We still don't know. And until someone digs beneath its paws or finds an inscription that settles the matter, the Sphinx will remain what it has always been, an enigma gazing toward the sunrise, silent and unyielding in the face of our questions. Inside the Great Pyramid, hidden within the massive body of stone, are 4 narrow shafts, channels barely large enough for a child to crawl through, that extend upward from the king's chamber and the queen's chamber at angles ranging from about 39 to 45 degrees. These shafts have been the subject of intense speculation since they were first explored in detail in the 19th century, and they present a puzzle that blurs the line between architecture, astronomy, and ancient belief systems. Originally, Egyptologists assumed the shafts were simple ventilation channels, meant to provide fresh air to workers sealing the burial chambers. But that explanation started to crumble as soon as researchers examined the shafts more closely. For one thing, the so-called Queen's Chamber shafts don't actually penetrate all the way to the exterior of the pyramid. They stop short, ending in stone doors, equipped with copper fittings. If they were for ventilation, they need to be open to the outside air. For another, the shafts are precisely angled and carefully constructed, carved through the core blocks with the same exactitude we see elsewhere in the pyramid. That's a lot of effort for simple air ducts. In the 1960s, astronomer Virginia Trimble and Egyptologist Alexander Badawi proposed a radical alternative. The shafts weren't for ventilation at all. They were symbolic passageways aligned with specific stars, designed to allow the soul of the deceased pharaoh to ascend to the heavens and join the gods. Trimble calculated that around 2500 BC, the southern shaft from the king's chamber was aimed almost directly at the culmination point of Orion's belt, the constellation associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife. The northern shaft from the king's chamber, meanwhile, pointed toward Thuban, a star in the constellation Draco that was the pole star in ancient Egypt, the star around which all other stars appeared to revolve. In Egyptian cosmology, the circumpolar stars were known as the imperishables, stars that never set below the horizon, and they were associated with eternal life. If the shafts were designed to point at these symbolically significant stars, it would make sense as a religious and architectural statement. The pharaoh's spirit would journey through these channels to the realm of the gods, guided by stellar pathways. It's a beautiful idea, and it ties together astronomy, religion, and architecture in a way that feels very Egyptian, very consistent with what we know about their beliefs. But there's a complication, and it's a big one: the alignments are too precise to be purely symbolic. If the shafts were just meant to evoke the general direction of important stars, you'd expect them to be roughly aligned, not aligned to within a small fraction of a degree. And yet, when you calculate the sky as it would have appeared in 2500 BC and compare it to the actual angles of the shafts, the match is startlingly good. The southern shaft's angle corresponds almost exactly to the transit altitude of Al-Nitak, the lowest of the three stars in Orion's belt. The northern shaft lines up with Thuban at its highest point in the sky. This level of precision suggests that the builders were using the shafts as sighting devices, as physical embodiments of specific astronomical observations. Think about the engineering required. You're carving a narrow tunnel through dozens of yards of solid stone, maintaining a consistent angle, aiming for a point in the sky that you can only observe at certain times of the night, and you need to get it right because any deviation will throw off the alignment. How do you even check your work as you go? You can't see the stars from inside the pyramid. You'd need to have plotted the angles in advance, using external observations, and then transferred those angles into the internal geometry of the pyramid with extreme accuracy. That's not just symbolic, that's applied astronomy. Now here's where it gets even stranger. In the 1990s, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink used a small robot equipped with a camera to explore the southern shaft from the Queen's Chamber, which had never been fully investigated because of its narrow dimensions. The robot, nicknamed Up-You-Out, after the ancient Egyptian deity who opened the ways for the dead, crawled up the shaft for about 200 feet and then encountered a limestone block fitted with two corroded copper pins or handles. This door, as it came to be called in the media, blocked further progress, and its existence sparked a flurry of speculation. What was behind it? A hidden chamber? A burial vault? Sacred artifacts? In 2002, a second robot drilled a small hole through the door and inserted a fiber optic camera. On the other side was another small chamber and another door, this one without copper fittings. The mystery deepened. Why build a shaft that leads to a series of sealed spaces? If the shaft was symbolic, why the doors? If it was functional, what was the function? Nobody knows, and further exploration has been hampered by bureaucratic restrictions and concerns about damaging the monument. Picture yourself as an ancient priest or architect, standing in the Queen's Chamber during the final stages of construction. The chamber is rough-hewn compared to the polished perfection of the king's chamber. Its walls are unfinished. Its corbelled ceiling still bears chisel marks. You oversee the installation of these copper-fitted blocks deep within the narrow shafts, sealing off small chambers whose contents or purpose will remain secret. Were you hiding something? Were you creating symbolic thresholds for the soul to pass through? Or were these shafts part of a larger system, perhaps a network of passages and chambers we haven't yet discovered, designed for purposes we can't even guess? Some researchers have speculated that the shafts and the hidden chambers behind the doors might have been repositories for sacred texts or ritual objects, items placed there to endure for eternity, waiting for a future generation to discover them. Others have suggested more exotic possibilities, that the shafts were part of an acoustic or energetic system, that the pyramid was designed to resonate at certain frequencies, or that the whole structure functioned as a kind of machine, a device whose purpose has been lost to time. These ideas venture into speculative territory, and they're often dismissed by mainstream scholars. But the fact remains, we have precisely engineered shafts aligned with stars, fitted with copper components, leading to sealed chambers we're not allowed to fully explore. And until we do, the pyramid's internal geometry remains a partial mystery, a blueprint we can measure but not fully comprehend. About 500 miles south of Giza, near the modern city of Aswan, lies one of the most revealing and perplexing artifacts of ancient Egyptian engineering, the unfinished obelisk. This massive piece of red Aswan granite still lies in the bedrock of its ancient quarry, partially carved but abandoned before completion. If it had been finished, it would have stood about 137 feet tall and weighed nearly 1,200 tons, making it the largest obelisk ever attempted. But cracks appeared in the stone during the carving process, and the project was abandoned, leaving behind a monument frozen in mid-creation. And that's precisely what makes it so valuable. Because it was never removed from the quarry, we can see exactly how the ancient Egyptians worked granite, the hardest stone they routinely carved and moved. Or at least, we can see what they were trying to do, and that's where the problem starts. Because the evidence from the unfinished obelisk doesn't quite match the capabilities of the tools we believe they had. Walk through the quarry, and you'll see the marks left by the ancient workers, round, scoop-shaped depressions where the granite has been pounded away, channels cut into the bedrock to separate the obelisk from the surrounding stone, and trenches where the workers were undercutting the base to free the monolith. The standard explanation is that they used dolerite balls, hard, dense stones composed of a mineral tougher than granite, as hammers, pounding the granite surface repeatedly to pulverize the crystal structure and chip away material bit by bit. Experimental archaeology has shown that this technique works, that you can indeed shape granite by pounding it with dolerite. But the process is incredibly slow and labor-intensive. Estimates suggest that a single skilled worker, pounding for 8 hours a day, might remove a few cubic inches of granite in a day's work. To carve the unfinished obelisk, with its complex curves and precise surfaces, would have required thousands of workers laboring for months or even years, producing tons of granite dust and debris, and wearing through countless dolerite hammers. And yet, when you examine the scoop marks on the obelisk's surface, they're remarkably uniform in depth and spacing, suggesting a level of control and consistency that's hard to achieve with pounding. Some of the marks also show smooth, almost glassy surfaces on their interior walls, surfaces that don't quite look like the result of fracturing and pulverizing. This brings us back to the granite blocks in the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber, and the other massive granite elements scattered across Giza. If shaping granite with dolerite pounders is as slow and difficult as experiments suggest, how did the ancient Egyptians produce the dozens of massive, precisely shaped granite blocks that were incorporated into the pyramids and temples? How did they achieve the smooth, flat surfaces and the tight-fitting joints? And how did they accomplish this at a scale and pace that would have required an industrial operation involving thousands of workers and decades of continuous labor? Some researchers have proposed alternative techniques, that the Egyptians had access to harder metal tools than we've found evidence for, perhaps iron or hardened bronze that has since corroded away. Others have suggested the use of abrasive slurries, mixtures of water and sand containing quartz particles, combined with copper saws or drills to cut the granite. Experiments with these techniques show promise, but they also show that the process is slow and requires frequent replacement of the copper blades, which wear down rapidly. And we haven't found sufficient quantities of worn copper tools at Giza to account for the volume of granite work that was done. Then there's the question of the drill holes, core holes drilled into granite that show spiral grooves along their interior walls, as if the drill bit descended into the stone in a corkscrew pattern. Petrie, the same engineer who measured the pyramid so precisely, examined these drill cores and was baffled by the rate of penetration they implied. He calculated that the drill must have been cutting into the granite at a rate far faster than he could replicate with any tool available in the late 19th century. He speculated that the Egyptians might have used fixed jewel points, diamonds or corundum, embedded in their drills, or that they applied enormous pressure through some mechanical advantage we don't understand. But no such tools have been found, and the cutting rates remain anomalous. Modern stoneworkers, using diamond-tipped drills and high-speed rotary tools, can match or exceed the ancient cutting rates, but those technologies are 20th century inventions. How did Bronze Age craftsmen achieve similar results? The mystery is compounded by the sheer quantity of granite work, the temples associated with the pyramids, the casing stones, the sarcophagi, the obelisks erected in later periods. All of this represents millions of man-hours of labor working one of the hardest stones available, using techniques we can't fully reconstruct. Now let's be fair, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found the tools doesn't mean they didn't exist. Copper tools corrode, wood rots, and the abrasives would have been washed away or reused. The ancient Egyptians were intensely practical and resourceful. They recycled everything. It's entirely possible that they developed techniques, perhaps involving levers, counterweights, copper saws with quartz sand abrasives, and teams of highly skilled workers, that allowed them to work granite far more efficiently than we can easily replicate in small-scale experiments. But the lingering question remains, if these techniques were so effective, why don't we have more direct evidence? Why don't the tomb paintings and temple reliefs show us how it was done? The Egyptians documented many aspects of their daily life and monumental projects, but they're curiously silent on the specifics of hard stone working. Some researchers interpret this silence as evidence that the knowledge was restricted, a closely guarded secret of the master craftsmen's guilds. Others wonder if it's evidence that the techniques themselves were inherited from an earlier tradition, one that the later Egyptians only partially understood and could only imperfectly replicate. The unfinished obelisk, lying in its quarry like a frozen giant, offers us a glimpse into the process. But it's a glimpse that raises as many questions as it answers. How did they plan to move a 1,200-ton stone? How did they intend to carve its hieroglyphs and polish its surfaces to a mirror finish? And why, after all the labor invested in quarrying it, did they simply abandon it when cracks appeared instead of adjusting their plans or salvaging what they could? Perhaps, in the end, even the ancient Egyptians were daunted by the scale of their own ambitions. On the eastern side of the Giza Plateau, directly in front of the Sphinx and connected to Khufu's pyramid by a long causeway, stands the Valley Temple, a squat, imposing structure built from massive limestone and granite blocks that represent some of the most impressive stonework anywhere in Egypt. If you've never seen it in person, it's easy to underestimate the sheer mass and precision of this building. The walls are composed of limestone blocks that weigh between 50 and 200 tons each, blocks so large that you could park a car on top of one and the stone wouldn't even notice. These blocks are fitted together with extraordinary precision, their surfaces smooth and their joints almost invisible, creating walls that have stood for 45 centuries without mortar and without collapse. But what really makes the Valley Temple remarkable is the granite casing that covers much of the interior. Massive blocks of red and black granite, each weighing many tons, polished to a reflective finish and fitted together so tightly that the joints are almost imperceptible. This is polygonal masonry, a technique in which the blocks are not rectangular but have irregular, interlocking shapes that fit together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Stand in the interior of the Valley Temple, and you're surrounded by walls of gleaming stone, the granite catching the light in subtle ways, the weight and solidity of the place palpable. The ceiling is long gone. It was supported by massive granite beams that collapsed or were removed in later periods. But the walls and the pillars remain, and they convey a sense of permanence that few modern buildings can match. Now ask yourself, why go to all this trouble? Why carve irregular, interlocking blocks instead of simpler rectangular ones? Why polish granite to a mirror finish when rougher surfaces would serve the structural purpose just as well? The standard answer is that this was a temple, a sacred space associated with the mortuary cult of Kafir, and the quality of the stonework reflected the importance of the building. Fair enough. But it doesn't fully explain the engineering choices. Polygonal masonry is, in some ways, harder than rectangular masonry. Each block has to be custom-shaped to fit its neighbors, which means you can't just quarry a bunch of identical blocks and stack them up. You have to plan the layout, carve each block to match its specific position, and fit them together with millimeter precision. That's a massive investment of time and skill, and yet, it produces walls that are phenomenally strong and resistant to earthquake damage, because the irregular shapes lock together in ways that prevent them from sliding or pulling apart under stress. Interestingly, polygonal masonry appears in other ancient sites around the world, most famously at Sacsayhuaman and other Inca sites in Peru, where massive stones are fitted together with the same kind of precision and irregular geometry. The Inca walls have become iconic examples of mysterious ancient engineering, and they've sparked endless speculation about lost techniques, shared knowledge between distant cultures, or even intervention by some unknown advanced civilization. The mainstream explanation is convergent evolution, that different cultures, facing similar challenges, building durable structures in earthquake-prone regions with large stones, independently develop similar solutions. That's certainly possible, and there's no need to invoke anything more exotic. But the visual similarity between the polygonal masonry at Giza and at sites like Sacsayhuaman is striking, and it raises interesting questions about the spread of architectural knowledge in the ancient world. Did builders share techniques across vast distances? Were there master masons who traveled, bringing their skills to different projects? Or are we simply seeing the logical outcome of skilled craftsmen working within the constraints of available materials and tools? One of the more intriguing and controversial theories about the polygonal masonry at Giza and elsewhere involves geopolymers. The idea that at least some of the stones weren't carved from solid rock but were cast in place using a kind of ancient concrete made from crushed limestone, water, and binding agents. Proponents of this theory, like the French chemist Joseph Davidovits, point to chemical analyses of pyramid stones that show unusual mineral compositions and microscopic structures that could be consistent with artificial stone rather than natural limestone. If the blocks were cast, it would explain the precision. You could pour liquid stone into molds, achieving perfect fits without the need for extensive cutting and polishing. It would also explain the sheer quantity of blocks. Instead of quarrying, transporting, and carving millions of individual stones, you'd be manufacturing them on site, which would be far more efficient. But the geopolymer theory remains highly controversial. Most geologists and Egyptologists reject it, arguing that the chemical evidence can be explained by natural variations in limestone composition and that there's no historical or archaeological evidence that the Egyptians knew how to make large-scale stone concrete. The hieroglyphic records speak of quarrying and transporting stones, not of casting them. And the tool marks, chisel scars, and quarry sites we can still see today all suggest that the stones were indeed carved and moved, not poured. Still, the Valley Temple and its polygonal masonry refuse to give up all their secrets. Some of the granite blocks show signs of clamping. Metal clamps were inserted into carved grooves to hold adjacent blocks together. But the clamps are gone, likely removed in later periods when metal was valuable and the temples were quarried for building materials. The precise purpose and layout of the temple's interior spaces remain debated. Some rooms had pillars and likely served as halls for rituals. Others were small, enclosed spaces that might have been storerooms or sanctuaries. And the whole structure is connected to the Sphinx enclosure and to Kafir's causeway, suggesting it was part of a larger complex whose full design and function we're only beginning to understand. Archaeological excavations in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have revealed that the plateau was far more extensively built up in ancient times than we previously knew, with causeways, ramps, workers' villages, and subsidiary tombs covering the area. The Valley Temple was not an isolated monument but a node in a vast architectural and ritual landscape, a landscape that tied together the living and the dead, the earth and the stars, the king and the gods. And buried beneath the sand, beneath the rubble of collapsed structures and the debris of millennia, there may still be chambers and passages we haven't found, secrets that could illuminate the minds and motives of the builders. We've mapped the surface, but the depths remain unplumbed, and until we dig deeper, the Valley Temple will remain a monument to skill we can admire but not fully replicate, and to purposes we can guess but not fully know. Perhaps the most profound mystery of the Giza Plateau isn't any single monument or feature, but the complex as a whole. The relationships among the pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, the causeways, and the subsidiary structures that together form an integrated architectural and symbolic landscape. Because when you step back and look at the big picture, what you see is not a random collection of tombs and monuments built over generations, but a carefully planned complex whose layout seems to encode layers of meaning that go far beyond individual royal egos or religious rituals. The three main pyramids, Khufu's, Khafre's, and Menkaur's, are not aligned in a simple straight line. Instead, they're offset from one another, with the smallest, Menkaur's, placed slightly to the east of the line formed by the other two. This offset has led some researchers, notably Robert Schoch and his Orion Correlation Theory, to suggest that the three pyramids map the three stars of Orion's belt, with the imperfect alignment of the smallest pyramid matching the slightly offset position of the dimmest star in the belt, Mintaka. If you overlay a map of the Giza pyramids onto a star chart of Orion, the correspondence is surprisingly good, not perfect, but close enough to suggest that it might have been intentional. Critics have argued that the correlation is approximate at best, that the offset could be explained by practical considerations like the bedrock topography or the boundaries of the available building area, and that seeing celestial patterns in earthly monuments is an example of pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. But here's the thing, Orion wasn't just any constellation to the ancient Egyptians. Orion, which they called Sa, was the celestial form of Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, the ruler of the afterlife. And the Milky Way, which runs near Orion in the night sky, was seen as a celestial Nile, a river of stars along which the souls of the dead traveled. If the pyramids were meant to represent Orion, and if the Nile represents the Milky Way, then the entire Giza complex becomes a terrestrial mirror of the heavens, a sacred geography designed to facilitate the pharaoh's journey from death to eternal life among the stars. That's not a fringe idea pulled from pseudoscience. That's an interpretation grounded in what we know about Egyptian cosmology and religious beliefs. The debate is whether the physical layout of the monuments actually reflects that cosmology in a literal, planned way, or whether we're projecting our modern pattern-seeking onto ancient pragmatism. Now add the Sphinx to the picture. The Sphinx faces due east, looking toward the sunrise on the equinoxes. In ancient times, during the spring equinox around 2500 BC, the sun would rise in the constellation of Taurus, directly in line with the Sphinx's gaze. But if you go back further, to around 10,500 BC, a date that corresponds to the end of the last ice age and the African humid period, the sun on the spring equinox would have risen in the constellation of Leo, the lion. Some researchers have seized on this as evidence that the Sphinx, which has a lion's body, was carved to commemorate or mark that earlier age, the Age of Leo, and that the Giza complex as a whole might have origins stretching back into deep prehistory, long before the rise of pharaonic Egypt. This is the astronomical dating hypothesis, and it's controversial precisely because it pushes the timeline back so far and requires us to imagine a sophisticated culture existing thousands of years before we have any other evidence for such a culture in the Nile Valley. Mainstream archaeology finds no support for complex societies in Egypt before about 4000 BC, and certainly nothing capable of monumental architecture before the early dynastic period around 3100 BC. So either the astronomical alignments are coincidences, or they're symbolic references to mythic time rather than actual construction dates, or, and this is the heretical possibility, we're missing a chapter of history. Imagine walking across the plateau at dawn, the three pyramids rising behind you, the Sphinx ahead, the first rays of sunlight striking the ancient stones and casting long shadows across the sand. You're standing at the center of a complex that covers hundreds of acres, that required the labor of tens of thousands of workers over several generations, that consumed the resources of an entire kingdom. And yet, despite all the excavation and study, despite the satellite surveys and ground-penetrating radar, despite the books and documentaries and academic papers, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Why this site? Why this specific arrangement of monuments? What purpose did the complex serve beyond the obvious functions of tomb and temple? Was it an astronomical observatory, a ritual center, a symbolic map of the cosmos? Or was it something else entirely, something whose meaning we've lost because we're looking at it through the wrong cultural lens? The ancient Egyptians themselves, in their later texts and records, seem to have regarded Giza with a kind of awe, as if even they recognized that what their ancestors had built was extraordinary and beyond their own capabilities to replicate. Tutankhamun's engineers, Ramesses II's architects, none of them matched the precision or scale of the Giza monuments, despite having all the resources of the Egyptian state at their disposal. Why not? Was it because the knowledge had been lost? Or because the later pharaohs understood that Giza was unique, a one-time achievement tied to a specific moment in history and a specific vision that couldn't be repeated? There are also the smaller mysteries, the details that don't fit neatly into the standard narratives. The air shafts we discussed earlier from the king's chamber don't just point to stars, they point to specific stars at specific moments in the year 2500 BC, suggesting that the pyramid was designed with a kind of temporal specificity, an attempt to freeze a particular celestial configuration in stone. The causeway leading from Khafre's Valley Temple to his pyramid is aligned not due east-west but at a slight angle, and some researchers have suggested this alignment corresponds to solar or stellar rising points on specific ritual dates. The whole plateau is crisscrossed with alignments, lines of sight between monuments, geometric relationships among the pyramid's base lengths and heights, proportions that seem to encode mathematical constants. Some of these are surely coincidental, the inevitable result of analyzing a complex site with many measurable features. But some might be intentional, clues left by the builders about what they were trying to achieve. The problem is that we don't have a key to decode those clues. We don't have the instruction manual, the written explanation of what the complex was meant to do or represent. We have the monuments, silent and enigmatic, and we have our measuring tools and theories. And the gap between those two things, between the physical reality and our ability to interpret it, is where the mystery lives. So where does all this leave us, standing in the shadow of these ancient colossi, surrounded by stones that have outlasted empires and languages and entire civilizations? We've walked through the precision of the Great Pyramid's construction, examined the mathematical relationships encoded in its dimensions, puzzled over the weathered face of the Sphinx and the question of its true age, traced the stellar alignments of the internal shafts, confronted the granite problem and the mysterious techniques that shaped the hardest stone, admired the polygonal masonry of the Valley Temple, and considered the possibility that the entire Giza complex is a unified statement, a message carved in stone, written in the language of astronomy and geometry and myth. And what we've found, again and again, is that the evidence doesn't quite fit the comfortable narratives. The standard story, that the pyramids were built by Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure as tombs, using copper tools and muscle power and logistical genius, is probably basically true. But it's also incomplete. It doesn't fully account for the precision, the scale, the sophistication of astronomical knowledge, the erosion patterns on the Sphinx, the unexplored chambers and sealed shafts, or the techniques required to work granite at an industrial scale with Bronze Age technology. This isn't about rejecting scholarship or embracing wild theories. It's about recognizing that the Giza Plateau, despite being one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites on the planet, still harbors genuine mysteries. There are questions we can't answer, techniques we can't replicate, and anomalies that don't fit neatly into the boxes we've built for them. And that's okay. That's part of what makes archaeology and history so compelling. They're not finished stories but ongoing investigations, puzzles that each generation reinterprets with new tools and new perspectives. The ancient Egyptians themselves would probably recognize this sense of mystery. They built these monuments to endure, to speak to future ages, to stand as a testament to their achievements and their beliefs. And perhaps part of that message was intentional obscurity, a sense that some knowledge should remain hidden, some secrets should be earned through effort and insight rather than simply handed over. The sealed chambers, the shafts that end in stone doors, the alignments that hint at meanings we can only guess. Maybe these were deliberate choices, designed to make us work for understanding, to ensure that the monuments would remain numinous and powerful across the millennia. There's also a deeper human story here, one that goes beyond engineering and archaeology. The Giza Plateau is a monument to ambition, to the human drive to create something larger than ourselves, something that will outlast our individual lives and connect us to the eternal. The workers who hauled those blocks, the engineers who calculated the angles, the priests who consecrated the temples, the pharaohs who commanded the projects, they were all part of a collective effort that spanned generations. They worked in brutal heat, with primitive tools, under the weight of social hierarchies we can barely imagine, and yet they created something that still has the power to move us, to inspire us, to make us question our assumptions about what ancient people were capable of. That alone is worth contemplating. Even if we never solve every mystery, even if some questions remain forever unanswered, the fact that human beings 4,500 years ago could conceive of and execute projects on this scale is a testament to the potential that has always existed in our species. We are the same people, with the same brains, the same capacity for creativity and problem solving. And if they could do this, what might we achieve if we commit ourselves with the same focus and determination? But let's not romanticize it too much. These monuments were also built on the backs of laborers, many of whom probably had little choice in the matter, who worked hard and died young and never saw the finished structures they helped create. The pyramids represent not just human achievement but also human hierarchy, power, and the ability of elites to command resources and labor for their own purposes. The mystery isn't just, how did they do it? But, why did they do it? What compelled a society to invest so much in monuments to the dead? What did they believe they were achieving? The standard answer is that the pyramids ensured the pharaoh's successful transition to the afterlife, and that by securing the king's immortality, the entire kingdom benefited because the divine order was maintained. That's a worldview so foreign to most modern sensibilities that it's hard to fully grasp. But it's part of the puzzle. Understanding Giza means understanding a culture where the boundary between the living and the dead, between earth and sky, between the physical and the spiritual, was fluid and permeable in ways we've largely lost. So what should you take away from all this? First, that the Giza Plateau is not a solved mystery. It's an ongoing enigma, a place where every answer leads to new questions. Second, that ancient people were far more capable, far more knowledgeable, and far more creative than we often give them credit for. They didn't have our technology, but they had time, ingenuity, and a depth of cultural and religious motivation that drove them to achieve extraordinary things. Third, that there's value in not knowing, in living with uncertainty and mystery. The monuments at Giza invite us to wonder, to imagine, to ask, what if? And in a world where we often demand immediate answers and simple explanations, that invitation to sit with complexity and ambiguity is precious. Finally, that these mysteries matter not just because they're intellectually intriguing but because they connect us to our shared human past. The people who built Giza were our ancestors, not in a literal genealogical sense necessarily, but in a cultural and civilizational sense. Their achievements, their questions, their attempts to reach toward the eternal, those are part of our heritage, part of the story of what it means to be human. So the next time you see a photograph of the pyramids, or the Sphinx, or the Valley Temple, don't just see tourist attractions or ancient ruins. See the questions. See the precision that defies easy explanation. See the granite blocks that shouldn't have been possible to carve, the shafts that point to stars, the erosion patterns that hint at older origins, the mathematical relationships that seem too perfect to be accidental. See the gaps in our knowledge and the humility they demand. And keep digging, because some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, or perhaps beneath millennia of sand and silence, waiting for the right question, the right tool, the right moment when understanding finally breaks through and the stones begin, at last, to speak.